My name is Giancarlo Guaghet. Here is Gianni Taroni, a pilot, and Fabio Gagliani from Oggi weekly paper. Together with the Alfetta, we had a ride that we called from Cape North to Cape South. I'm gonna to show you the route. Please show the map. Here, Cape North, in Norway, down through Scandinavia, Germany, France and Spain. And then Africa, from Tangier first towards east and then through the Sahara Desert. Trek number 2, the most difficult one. Black Africa, Angola, South Africa, up to the Cape of Good Hope, the extreme south point. It was a ride along terrible treks. I also took a report, a movie. The heat ruined a little bit the film, but it's an interesting document. I didn't believe that an Alfetta that was just slightly modified in the filter of air and nothing else could make it, but you will see it starting from the extreme north point of Europe till the south point of Africa in a record time along a route which is extremely difficult. Let's have a look at it together. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this second episode of this year's Backstage. We have talked about the Tipo A, the great cars of the 30s, and now we get closer to us, but we talk about adventures. Behind me there is the Matta, which contributed to the raid of Fratellanza and Pace, one of the many Mattas used during the raids. We talked about that, and we will talk about the Angel of the Bimbi. And now we talk about another raid, and we still have the original car in the museum, the Cape North, Cape South raid done in 1973 by an Alfetta, driven by Mr. Taroni, Baghetti, and the journalist of Oggi, who in this adventure were the media partner, which followed the event with a coverage both on paper and video. But let's make a step backwards. 1973 is not the first raid of recent times. In reality, the previous year, Baghetti himself went from Milan to Calcutta with Alfa Sud, always with Oggi guaranteeing the coverage, and it was an adventure crossing a good part of the continent, creating sensation and guaranteeing a certain number of images and reportages showing how the small Alfa Sud, which was recently born and was an innovation in the Alfa Romeo world, was able to cross half the world without problems, even where the roads were not the roads that were studied for the Alfa Sud. So Alfa Romeo starts to think about an idea. There are letters of the beginning of March thinking to use the Alfetta for a raid. Alfetta was presented in the meantime. So our archive collects the documents of the time which led to this adventure, and the agreement with Oggi is outlined, and also a sort of scheme of responsibilities and liabilities came out. So who does what, from Espet to Pub to Leas to the personnel department. So each department was responsible with a specific thing. Legal office for insurance, another department, the preparation of the car, sales office, the relationship with the other dealers, which would have had a role in this raid. And when everything was ready in May, on this pink sheet of paper, Dr. Moro was formally asked the authorization to go on. And in the summer, everything was ready, and off they went. It was an adventure that we will talk about in the different steps, but also in the behind the scenes of that feat. And to do that, we relied on the protagonists of that ride, who recorded a beautiful documentary, but to add something more, we also invited a guest who did for 14 times the tour of the world, 500,000 kilometers, crossing hundreds of frontiers, and Beppe Tenti, the guru of Overland. Thank you to all the listeners and viewers. It is really true. I didn't want to stay in an office, so I thought that it would fit my state of mind, the traveling way of life. But I met many difficulties, because only if you travel you find obstacles at the borders, the police, etc. It is not easy, but traveling is something that I wish to everyone, because it's a lesson of life. Those who travel have an open mindset compared to those who stay in an office where there is nothing to do. And if you travel, you meet people of every color, you meet population. Some also paint their skin, but it's a lifestyle which opens your mind. And this taught me that you need to be respectful of the populations. I didn't go there to say, look at this car, even though I had to put under pressure the cars that I received, especially the trucks, because I'm sure you've seen Overland, you've watched the episodes of Overland, and it is apparent that watching Overland, you can imagine how many difficulties the trucks overcame. But if you have the will, you can overcome difficulties. What Cape North, when it was done by the Alfetta and by me in the beginning of the 80s, it was not as easy as it is today. When you go straight, there is a tunnel, you go in the tunnel below the mountain, and you go on a road that takes you directly to Cape North. Nothing like that. You had to take a ferry. You went where cod is fished. It was stinky. It was another way of traveling. And then, of course, everything changed. The times are different. And now if you want to go from Cape North to Italy, for example, or go to Spain or whatever, it is extremely more easy. But coming here to the Museum of Alfa Romeo, I've seen this morning a sign, 5th lane, work in progress. And I was used to drive on tracks, beaten tracks, with this car, with this same car, because the roads were not present. And in Africa, still today, there are hardly paved roads. And when this raid was organized, the managers knew that, so they authorized the production to take 2 identical Alfettas with this Le Mans light blue, and to destin these first to the ESPE, which would prepare them, and then to the raid. The 2 cars were produced in very similar way, very closely. The license only has 2 numbers of difference. So the first was given to Baghetti, Taroni and Galliani, who start from Milan, go to Cape North, and then a video shooting was done for the introduction of the raid, and then they start crossing Europe downwards. And then in Sevilla, in the Alfa Romeo dealer, there would be a meeting with another car driven by 2 mechanics by Alfa Romeo, Battistini and Crisafulli, who would have assisted the others. And that is very important also to record the movies in the African continent, because of course it was more difficult to cross that continent. But since the beginning, the Alfetta was conceived, well, slightly modified with a few protection devices, so it was prepared to withstand not only mud and sand, but also the thermal exertion, because you went from a few degrees below zero from Cape North, and then it went to the Sahara Desert and Africa with a lot of degrees. So everything starts from Cape North. What are the main difficulties of cold? And then we'll talk about the hot weather. Well, the main obstacles of cold weather are the fact that you have to have a car which withstands the cold. If you think that I used to go from Rome to New York in winter, minus 63 was the temperature, and I never had a problem. You know why? Because the trucks of Iveco, which is sort of a relative to Alfa, had air-cooled engines, so they didn't suffer the problem of cold in the water system. So we did incredible things. We went to frozen lakes to get to Alaska, and then from Alaska to New York. That was the first overland trip. But in order to go in the countries, in order to have the permits, because the difficulty is not the difficulty of the car, it is the patience of the driver and travelers, because there are so many problems with police borders. People you meet on the road which want only one thing everywhere in the world: money. If you give them money, everything is solved. So that's the conclusion on the difficulty you have when you travel around the world. But I could talk for years. Well, Alfa Romeo had an advantage because it had a commercial network. There were dealers, importers, commercial partners, which was very present. So the crew was given a dossier which not only had the list of the medicines and the list of the devices, but also the list of all the useful contacts that I could use. Nonetheless, the raid with 26,057 kilometers would last 25 days, but 12 of these would be spent still waiting for documents to arrive or for bridges, for example, to be fixed. But we will see this step by step. Husband and wife from Lapland came to see our Alfetta. We are in Cape Horn, and here is the sea, 300 meters of cliffs. Europe finishes here. You cannot go more north, because then 0 kilometers of nothing and the ice cap. We start a beaten earth trek. We have to run because we have many kilometers in front of us. The ferry boat brings us from the island to the roads of Lapland, if roads can be defined. It is summer, but there are 2 degrees below zero. There's ice on these lakes of tundra. There's no asphalt, there's always stones and ice. But the Alfetta was fast. Here are at the North Pole with coffee, and this is the asphalt of Swede roads. We started from Cape North, an uninterrupted route till Sevilla. Here is Stockholm. Yesterday we saw the midnight sun in Cape North, And now there is an alternation of day and night, but for us, nothing changes. We continue without leaving the engine cool down. The ferry boat brings us from Sweden to Denmark and then a long run through Germany, France and Spain. And here we are in Plaza de Capitania in Sevilla, 6,000 kilometers in 4 days and 3 nights from Tundra to Andalusia, from -2 degrees to 38 degrees the Alfetta, withstood all the types of roads from Lapland to Germany. In Sevilla, we organized the Alfetta for Africa, so bigger tires and air filter. And we followed the Cavaliere del Rossio in honor of the Holy Mary of Rossio, which means dew. And then the ferry boat brings us to Africa. Apart from the midnight sun and the first kilometers in the polar weather, the rest of the European part is a full throttle journey. Baghetti pushed the Alfetta at maximum speed, but it was also important from the communication point of view because they crossed the entire European continent and then they took a ferry, they landed in Morocco, and from here the situation and the difficulties change. Northern Africa, Rabat, in front of the Hassan II castle. The gate of the old Fez, one of the cities of the emperor, and the souks, the markets. So we are leaving behind the green area of Northern Africa and we are going towards the desert. Children look at us very curious. Heat starts to beat. There are 48 degrees in the shadow. The Sahara brings a warm wind sweeping the roads. And then we meet two cameliers. The wind obliges us to put scarves on our mouth, but the cameliers withstand it, and the animals are looking for the bushes. We sleep like this. We are so tired that we forget the Scorpios, and we don't let the Alfetta rest. The temperature of air and oil are 90 and 110, the same as when we were in Cape North, with -2 degrees here. At the oasis of Namun, temperature is around 60. Namun, the red oasis for the color of houses, is the last one before the great leap into the desert. The last oasis is this one, Tragat, former French capital in the Sahara. These are the last palm trees. And this is the last sign of life, a Tuareg cemetery, small stones and small amulets, small leather pouches with a mix of spices, ashes and bones. Here is Tanetsu. As Tuareg call it, the land of fear. There is nothing. There is no Scorpios, there is nothing. You fear of losing the track. We have to run fast. We meet the relics of the cars which tried to follow the same route. 1,500 kilometers of desert. The fuel for the Alfetta, and we get refreshed. There are 2 wells in the whole route and the temperature is 65 degrees. And off we go in the desert, avoiding the sand pits and not losing the track. We meet Bedouins at Bidon 5, an old French military outpost, now abandoned. We meet some died animals' bones abandoned by the caravans that transport animals. And then we approach the savannah. But the trek is very difficult. Here the Alfetta is in the sand. We avoided many times the risk of breaking everything. The test was extreme. It was almost impossible that a car built for asphalt roads could resist. We drink water which has the flavor of the disinfecting tablets. Giraffes tell us that we are in the Black Africa region. Despite being a car to be driven on the road, the Alfetta was very good on the sandy desert. Beppe, how many times did you cross the desert? 5 times. The first time was the most tragical one, because we went from Rome to New York via land, and then Land of Fire, Tierra del Fuego, and from Tierra del Fuego we went to the Cape of Good Hope, and then we started to go upwards, not from this route but from here. We crossed Zimbabwe, Tanzania, Kenya. Well, the desert of Kenya was difficult. We went in the mud, it was raining, it was the rainy season, and then always crossing the desert. We went to Djibouti. From Djibouti, we went on a ferry and we went to Saudi Arabia, and we went up first through the United Arab Emirates, and then we went to Saudi Arabia, where in Riyadh we received an incredible treatment for lunch. And I remember that in Yemen we went through the Ladramaut corridor. We were there, there was the army in front of us with bazookas and guns, and then there were 3 trucks and a lot of sand. I'm always at the back, so I can check the situation. I had a driver, so at a certain point we stopped for the sand to go down. There was a corridor, very narrow, and at a certain point, behind a rock, come 3 people with Kalashnikovs. I say, Carlo, stop, they're gonna fire and shoot to us. And he went outside the window. When he was at 10 meters, he speeded up and went against them. And these 3 men, even though they had a Kalashnikov, were startled and jumped away. We went away with our truck, and they, of course, shoot the truck, and there are still the bullets in the truck. But this desert that they cross now it is impossible. It is ISIS zone. Here, now they shoot at you. But here, the Falaise de Dogon is incredible. We still had the possibility to visit it. This is the most beautiful part: Mali, Niger, Nigeria, Togo, Ghana, Benin. These are all things that I did in a second trip. So instead of going up and going to Cape North, we started from Italy and we went down, doing all the coast. And here we stopped with the desert just before Nigeria. We've seen ice, we've seen savanna, sand of the desert and mud, but the Alfetta performs really well. There were very few problems, a few punctured tires and not much. So the car was the same as it was produced in the hangars, just with a few protections, but let's look at it more in detail. For communication reasons, it was important that the Alfettas used in this raid were a series cars, so the modifications that we see are not structural amendments, but just precautions to withstand certain specific conditions of the raid. First of all, each part and service has a protection and a filter. So a waterproof protection and a filter that protects from the dust. And then another add-on is an air filter which is washable and which is added to the normal filter that for the stretches of journey could be opened. So through this lever, two different filters could be used, either the normal one or the one with filters, and then we have a series of relays, and that's it, apart from another apparent modification, which is this protection, which closes the cover of the valves to protect the igniters in order to avoid this part to be frozen, and to protect the engine, which was bolted using the same bolts that kept the usual covers of valves in the Alfa Romeo cars. And then if we look from the outside, there are add-ons of these lamps here next to the windshield, a protection in the front, which went on in the lower part, which a very sturdy cover protecting the engine from all the bumps of the car. And a similar protection was also applied below the differential and the shift, which is in the back part in the Alfetta. In the cars used for the raid, also a big equipment holder was placed for the tanks, for the tents, but this would never come back to the Portello. It was lost during the trip back. If we open the car, the inside is exactly the same as the cars which are sold normally. There is just the application of a series of switches for the supplementary lamps, the fans, and nothing much. For the rest, it is just like all the other Alfettas. Between the seats, there is a support for two cylinder containers that we still don't know whether these were fire extinguishers, fuel tanks, or water bottle holders. What is very important is the kilometer counter. Our reports say that the car during the raid from Cape North to Cape South went through 26,057 kilometers. If we consider the 3,000 kilometers from Milan to Cape North, where the car went and started, then we get to 29,286 kilometers. After that, the car was kept in the hangars of the museums and probably didn't run any more kilometers. If someone is added, it's just a few tests done before. So the car drove for the first half, okay, the European part by itself, and then with an assisting car during the African stretch. And if we take the keys and we go and open the hood, we see that there are still traces of those journeys. Here we can see that there are no carpets, of course, which were useless. The supports for gasoline tanks, another filter, but also we can see randomly some spare parts. Some are broken, some have been changed. So a jack, a protection part. So the car still today appears as it was brought to the Portello after doing that incredible raid. We still have traces of dust, mud and dirt and certain hidden parts of the body of the car. But there's one last thing that shows how it was brought back to the museum without being modified. In this compartment, the same of the Alfetta, we still can find the insurance certificates, those of the few months of life before the raid, but especially the international ones for the raid, covering the car up to the final day when it was back in Milan in 1974. So, the outside of the car shows a few damages, but only on the surface, and the only change is the use of tires that can travel on all terrains from the sand and jungle in Africa to the ice of the North Pole. Giraffes tell us that we are in the Black Africa region. We run on the tracks of Niger. We overpassed the Great Sahara obstacle, but the tricks for the Alfetta are not over. 5,000 kilometers of tracks are in front of us. We meet the first typical African village. In the Black Africa, we will cross, apart from Mali and Niger, Niamey, Nigeria, Cameroon, Gabon and Congo. We will find very few asphalt roads just before and after the big centers. Here are the roads of Black Africa. You can get a glimpse of what 5,000 kilometers of this trek means, and the Alfetta continues to go on, but there are tricks and traps you fall in before you could slow down the car. Tracks and villages different every time as the vegetation and the landscape change. The radiator tube is broken and we replace it with the curiosity of the children looking at us. Here is a nice asphalt road, but in Africa you don't have to hope on asphalt a lot. Short stretches and then this is what you find. We go on the trek here in the big forests of Cameroon, full of pythons and gorillas. If you want to walk, you have to use machetes. You can look at the indigenous people grating manioca to be then put in big leaves for conservation. You can eat the monkey cola, the fruit of monkeys who live by millions in the forest. You're never safe on that road. There are very small and fragile bridges. A truck goes on them and breaks them, and the traffic is stopped for 2-3 days. You have to go backwards or find an alternative road. And here we are again on the usual tracks, but our Alfetta is very sturdy. These are fisher women. They're coming back from the river. We punctured the tire, in total 3 in the whole trip. And here we are at 0 parallel, the equator. We are in Gabon. The sign says you are crossing the equator. The savannah is on fire. On this side of the equator it is winter, but it is warm enough for these phenomenon of combustion. We can see another characteristic of the tracks that put to the test the amortizers and dampers. In the village there are many children, always curious, sometimes shy, sometimes very exuberant. And then water on the tracks. There is no traffic. Hundreds of kilometers pass without finding someone with an engine. And here women are washing clothes. And the Alfetta continues its route on the Black Africa tracks. We are in the Congo. We are on a barge and we crossed the river. We have almost finished to cross Black Africa. We ran for 5,000 kilometers of impossible road, and then we drove the Alfetta. We could have done that in 20 days, but we were desperate to get to the final point, and we did it in 7 days. The last snack with pineapple in a village, and here are the big baobabs of Angola, 32 meters at the base. Here we are in one of the many South African parks for a safari. South Africa offered us very nice roads with asphalt, but we continued to use the Alfetta as a Land Rover, running behind the animals in the savannah. These black women learned from the German colonies to dress, and even though Germans in southwestern Africa are no longer there, they continue to do that and dress with very proud stares. We met also the lions, but the lions were not curious with us. Sometimes they're annoyed by us. We go south, and here we are on the asphalt, but every now and then we go off-road. We meet the big ostrich farms that you can also ride, as you can see. We meet a very colorful Bantu village where women, still linked to a very old tradition, bring big rings around ankles and necks. The more they have, the more beautiful they are. We are near Cape Town. We meet baboons, curious, and Taroni quarrels with one of them and fails. Both on Oggi, the magazine which followed the entire raid, and on the Quadrifoglio, which published the reports, it is underlined how Baghetti drove at full throttle. And I imagine that it is not easy to go at high speed on those roads, or even when there are no roads. What do you think? Well, you are perfectly right. You cannot go at a fast speed, also because if you don't have the culture of traveling with a car in Africa, the kids even today, they hear a noise and they run in front of the car, so you have to be very careful. You are always stressed out. So I could see at certain Africa, especially in Rwanda, in Kenya, in Tanzania, and especially with animals, as it was in the past. So going in the Ngorongoro crater, which is a huge hole, I think it's the biggest crater in the world. And there are animals which are inside, cannot go out because there's a small narrow road, and there are any kind of animal shape and breed. And this, if you want to do a nice travel, when you go there and you are amazed by such an incredible nature, which is still there in Tanzania, for example. Apart from the fact that you've got the Kilimanjaro, I was 19 times on the top. I went there with 1,246 people. But people have fun. You know why? Because it's the only point, being on the equator, where you stand still. You get there in the morning around 6, 7, and you wait for the sun to come up. And you know what you see? You see the earth, which is round, because you see the round sphere. And people, they really start shooting so many pictures. It is too beautiful. And then there's a brightness, which is a wonder. That is what I can say. Even though this part here, it says southwestern Africa, but now it's Namibia with Windhoek, its capital, which is an important country, not only for fishing. Here there is a coast where all the ships are taken, all the old ships are disassembled. So there are shipyards who just cut and then they have iron and wood, etc. So I could talk for 2 days telling about the savannah, the forest. It is a great wonder. Africa, for me, from the point of view of nature, is the most beautiful country, hoping that it will remain like this. We would stay for hours to listen to what you say, because these adventures are so charming. But you traveled the world dozens of times with cars, with trucks. I know that sometimes you also went from Peking to Paris from the Littoral 1907. Maybe it's the most beautiful ride ever. But have you ever driven an Alfa Romeo? Well, the Itala gave me was given to me twice by the Museum of Turin. Once it was sent to Peking on a plane. There was a Tipo, an Alpha 33, which I will talk about later on. There were 2 pandas. One, I was driving it. There was a problem because Fiat in Paris did big shows with all its cars. So there was a series including the Delta, the Lancia Delta, but they were very very proud. So, proud of being French. When Cesare Romiti and the direction of Fiat, the manager, understood that I could go to Paris with all the cars, they said, okay, they sent everything to Pechino, and I went to Pechino and I started to drive the Itala, and the Itala helped other cars, which in the track 1989 we went from Tiananmen Square with the square full of students. It was the moment when the revolution was about to explode in China, the students' revolution. So we crossed China. We went to Kashgar, which is the last city, which is now kind of difficult due to the Uyghurs, etc. And then we went up to Kunjarab, which is very high, 5,000 meters. And then we went back down. But we didn't see cars coming up, and we said, why? We wondered why. So we get to Karimabad, which is the city where the Aga Khan was born, where he is a god. So until his father was there, so they didn't pay taxes. So they put him on a scale, this man on a scale, and on the other side, they put gold until the scales were on balance. And from Karimabad we went down, and there I had the Alfa Romeo, the Alfa 33. So many of you listening to this have probably drove the Alfa 33. It is a very sturdy car, nothing was broken, never a problem. And we went to the Kunjarab and we went down, and at a certain point after Karimabad we start to see some cars in a line. So I said, why? And they said there was like an avalanche of rocks. It's been 15 days, we've been waiting, but no one does nothing. So I said to my driver on the Alfa 33, well, listen, didn't we went in front of barracks like a dozen kilometers ago? I said, yes, so stop, let's go back. This is getting dangerous, I have an idea. So we went back 10 kilometers. I found barracks with policemen or the army. I said, everything is stopped. Can you sell me some dynamite? And they said, this man is mad. And they showed dollars. I said, yes, yes. So they went inside. They brought me 125 kilograms of dynamite. I put them in the car. I paid. I went back. It's so on the films. So there was this TNT. Well, there was a huge rock. Huge rock. So 125 kilograms of TNT. So I was very worried because we could explode, me, the driver, the Alfa 33. Then we put the TNT, the dynamite, that we ran away, but not only the road was cleared away, but also a part of mountain went down, and instead of going on the road, went down in a valley. So we shoot everything, very happy, we were in front of everyone. So we went to Islamabad, where Benazir Bhutto was still there, but the particular element of the Alfa 33, which maybe is mostly dear to me, is that it's 125 kilograms of TNT that we made explode. We nicknamed it the Alfa Vedetta. So at the time it was in front of the Itala because its service was too important. And this is one of the many anecdotes, but I have so many. Well, let's say that Alfa Romeo always tested very deeply its cars. Maybe the TNT is one of the experiences that go beyond every testing step. So it crosses the entire Africa. You get to the end of this raid, and it is time to do the reports. The Alfetta had very few problems, and the average was more than 800 kilometers per day in all the 29 days of the journey, with a consumption which was 6.14 kilometers with a liter, which, considering the stretches done in the sand or in the mud at low gear, shows that this Alfa Romeo was designed in a perfect way. But the Alfa Romeo didn't neglect any detail, and as we can see in the archive documents, in the end everything is recalculated: what was spent, the cost of this expedition, what was gained, but they also thought of how to reuse of the devices that were used. As we have seen, the Cape North, Cape South raid was an adventure which touched all the departments, or almost all the departments, of Alfa Romeo, and which had an incredible result in terms of image and communication. But the first sheet of paper, when you open this folder, is the one with the figures. So December the 31st, 1974, so when also the expenses of bringing back the cars from the Cape to Genova, what they spent was what would be today less than 200,000 euros. So an investment, considering the results, which is acceptable. But the Alfa Romeo leaves nothing to fate, so it charges the staff to make an inventory of what went back to the company, and this is the report in a note of June the 10th, 1984. So all the material was examined, we selected what can be reused again, and we went to Diaz and even Prov, all the spare parts, the devices, the equipment that could be reusable. So we sent the material listed here, and the list shows the car and all the tools, the spare parts which were not used on board. The Divan Prov will be sent all the personal equipment of the pilots. This material is in perfect condition, but for hygienical regions and in order to be kept for time, should be washed. So windshield jackets, trousers, helmets, etc. That etc. leads way to another list with how many pieces of garment for each item. To me, the expense will be justified by the perfect condition of the material, as if the idea was to run another raid, even though more probably new material would have been used. But as always, the archive allows us to go into all the details of these activities, which we want to remind you, apart from adventure, had a promotional goal to show how a car like the Alfetta could withstand all the conditions in the world. In '73 it was an incredible adventure. Alfetta S54134, and its assisting car with 136 in the license. And it was also an incredible day today with the protagonist and with Beppe Tenti, who I would like to thank for his contribution and for the enthusiastic way it tells these stories. Thank you. I can continue. Go on Rayun and you find everything under Overland. You'll have fun. And I also thank you, our viewers. The next episode will be live in the Sala Giulia, so we're waiting for you. And we leave you with the images of this Alfetta, which a few years ago went to Cape South, well, at the end of this adventure, where then it will go on a boat and arrive in Genoa, and here we are in the Alfa Romeo collection. These are the last kilometers of our trip. The African continent is almost coming to an end. 27,000 kilometers, crossing 2 continents, 29 days and 14 hours ago we were in Cape North, and now we are at the Cape of Good Hope. In front of us we have the Atlantic Ocean and the Indian Ocean. The raid is over.